On stage here, we're not necessarily doing the sort of the dialogue thing other than just with everybody out there. So we have Kathy Abbott, Kenneth Allendorfer, and Carla Hackworth, familiar names from the earlier parts of the day. And I know Carla and Kenneth want to, in part of this session, want to say something about the research roadmap that you're developing. But in general, this session is about human factors next steps. So we want to think about what we just heard today from the various FAA offices and try to get an understanding from the human factors community what we think we heard, and did we learn anything? Do we have a better idea of maybe where we want to go? We might not so much in terms of technical content, but maybe in terms of process, like how we all work together and work with the offices. Whatever we know, that's, but if we do have technical ideas on where to go or questions about from anyone, because we all have our own ideas about what needs to be done in UAS human factors. So we'll let the panels, if we want to start. Kathy, did you want to start and just offer your opinions on the day, and then we'll get to them talking about a little bit more about the research roadmaps, or they can go first and then you can come after them? Okay. All right, so Carla and Kenneth, why don't you guys go first?
Okay.
If you could just describe sort of what happened at CAMI earlier in the year and what you learned from that, and how that compares to what we learned today, and then that's kind of you guys are the research perspective on this, and then Kathy will follow you. Okay. Go ahead.
Well, so we, Kenneth and I, and well, several folks in this room. So we held we called it a summit, right? So it was a human factors research summit, and it was in last November at UAS. Factors, yeah. Sorry, at CAMI. And the idea was to bring together a group of folks from the UAS human factors community to talk about what are the current research issues and what's on the horizon that should be addressed within UAS. So we had people from industry, people from the various providers as far as research providers to FAA, and then we also had some folks within the UAS program office, and then performing organizations like Kenneth and I as well. Well, one thing that we did before we held the summit was we gave folks kind of a homework assignment before they came to develop really a listing of the various topics that they thought needed to be addressed within research, within UAS human factors research. And that went to the UAS program office as well. And so all of this had the blessing of the UAS program office, which I really think was key from the outset, because we had their buy-in, and it wasn't that there were a bunch of these human factors geeks coming up with great ideas of what they should do. They were a part of it and gave plenty of feedback, as well as they were very participative within the summit itself. So we had this list, and Kevin Williams and Kenneth had a good homework assignment and went through them and put them into these categories, if you will. They whatever, some people might call it a contingency operations in air traffic, and other people might call it what are you going to do when things go wrong, kind of thing. So we had these four basic areas, and then we actually invited everyone. We came for a day and a half there at CAMI and just brainstormed and put the groups separate, had them brainstorm again, try to really drill them down into some solid, what could actually be researched, what could we actually do. Then after the summit, we collated everything that they'd come up with, and then took those and put them into a survey format and sent them to all of the participants of the summit and said, tell us, kind of drill it down and tell us what's the most important, and then who's going to do something with this, and then what's the urgency associated with each of these research areas. Currently, we are writing up the proceedings of this, and we'll be delivering it as a public product. My hope was to have that sooner than it is happening. But at the same time, I have to be mindful that when you bring in a large group of folks, and we also are talking about UAS, you can see it's a very sensitive topic. I want to make sure that we give the program office plenty of time to review, and then also all the contributors. So Kenneth, you have more to add?
Yeah, so one of the things people have said a couple times is how this is reverse dog years or whatever, right? So that was in November last fall when we kind of went through those lists, and in the interim since then, things have come up. So our existing research processes where we plan 3 years out and you develop good reps and preps and we do all that stuff, that's going to be very hard for us to be responsive to this industry in this particular case because of how rapidly the technology is changing and how much sort of commercial and political pressure are being put to kind of get this stuff into the world. And so we're at kind of a difficult point, which is that we have a system for developing research and providing support, but it doesn't jive so well with what the reality is of this particular topic. And so we've got some work to do, I think, as a community to figure out how to live in this particular world. And so things like this are an attempt to start that.
And a couple of the other things that have also kind of occurred after that. Well, the TCRG process started for UAS, and so that's been very advantageous to try to get in these topics, and they've been very receptive. I attend those, and they're very receptive if you have an idea to put those forward, and then try to get that within the requirements process. The other thing that was something that was mentioned at our forum was I don't know the best way to describe it, but I'll say disconnect, or at least there was in the past a means to keep air traffic separate from
Right.
AVS.
Right.
And that requirements from air traffic were not, I don't know how that, I'm being recorded. Yes, they were separate. Yes, we'll just say they were separate.
Had their own process. Right.
So they had their own process. But now I know that that is not the case, and that they are welcome within the UAS, TCRG. And we had perfect example. We had plenty of air traffic ops people here today talking about the needs, and even saying, can you be more forward in what you think we should consider? And so I think we should take every opportunity and advantage of that, given that they've put it out there and we have a vehicle in order to do that.
Okay, I'm going to try and take us up a level. Research is really critical, but we need to look at the whole picture. So you've heard me say earlier about human factors practice, and I want to really expand that to maybe get you to think of all this as kind of a feedback loop, because I haven't heard people talking about this so much. I mentioned earlier some of the practice about, and Wes mentioned it, getting human factors involvement in writing the rules and the ACs and the policies that are related to all this. Getting it out into the operations, into the airspace definition. But another piece that I also want to encourage people to think about is, once we get things out there, monitor how it's going. Monitor the implementation, what's working, what's not, so we can feed that back in. In AVS, our highest priority is continued operational safety. That goes above everything. So we have to make sure that we have processes in place for monitoring that operational safety as we implement these new things. And that's not something I've really heard anybody talk about very much today. I know that there are people out there thinking about it. but it just hasn't really been discussed much today. I know that's bigger than human factors, but human factors is a huge part of it. So that's part of what I wanted to mention is, yes, we need to focus on research. To build on one of your points, we need a much more agile and responsive research system. But I'm wondering, we're limited in the number of human factors practitioners. How do we help get some of the research folks? Believe me, if you want to do research, you don't want to be a practitioner. They're two completely different things. But we might need to move a little more in each other's direction to help make the bridge. Some researchers are very good at doing human factors practice. Some are not interested at all because they don't know the context. They don't know the operational context. They're not really interested necessarily in that. So I can point you to several people, some who are in this room, who are really fantastic researchers getting into the operational side, the implementation side. But I think we need to, as a human factors community, step back and say, how can we make sure all the bases are covered? With that, I'll just open it up to the group.
One jump off from there, which is that at the summit, one of the cool things about the summit was that it was a lot of FA people and a lot of academic people, and our friends from MITRE and NASA and so on. But also there were a number of industry people there. So UAS manufacturers who were interested in kind of getting hooked in with this, and one of them was I won't, if I could remember I wouldn't say, but one of the companies, their whole, what they would call their human factors group, or their pilot cockpit workstation design group, consisted of one person who wasn't a pilot and wasn't really was a programmer, and had a guy who was a retired cop sort of advising him because he used a drone when he was a cop or something like that. And so, we look at the resources they have, or the what they're going to be able to do as a company versus what somebody like Boeing does with their human factors groups. And at the moment, the U.S. manufacturers that we've been exposed to are not. They don't have that kind of. It may be a choice. It's a choice on their part, which is how much of that to devote. But they don't have a team of 20 human factors people who are designing the cockpits or the ground stations. They might have one person who probably hasn't ever done it before.
That's true for a lot of the manned aircraft manufacturers.
Well, okay, right. Yeah, so maybe Boeing's not the best. Yeah, so maybe it's more of a small thing. But somewhere along the line, we have to. They're going to take some of the work on that. We want them to do some of it, and at the moment, they're not really set up for that. So how do we get them to realize it's important and start making some investments on their own personnel and their own laboratories and capabilities to be able to do that kind of work? Because at the moment, they're kind of winging it, and at least some of them are. And so we need a challenge for them, and they aren't there yet.
I was going to say, though, that's a problem. It's partially a problem because we don't tell them what to do, or we don't have the guidance. But the standards, there's a lot of them in manned aircraft that they could use, they just choose not to. So that's.
There's a lot of just very basic things, but a lot of these places are in the position of they don't know what they don't know.
Yeah.
And to Kenneth's point, they pull in people that don't have the aviation background, so they don't know where to look. They don't even know that they should be looking. And that's the issue is to educate them that, hey, there are some standards that could help you in this process,
And
design process.
And some of that stuff may just be basic display design. They're not even at the point where they know how to necessarily build a good Windows user interface, right? Let alone a cockpit, right? So even if they just started there, they got the human factors design guide, they got the Windows GUI standard and started with that would get at least some of them partway down the road, and that would be a big step for them. At the moment, they're just kind of winging it.
Exactly, and that information is already out there. They just don't know.
Right, they don't know.
To look or where to look.
Use a microphone. Well, there's the people on the call too that might not hear. Yeah.
So, being probably the oldest person here, I saw this also with automobiles. All right, and SAE became very important on self-policing, and they did it because of liability. So if a group of people come up and say that even though it's backwards to have your, go park reverse when you want to look back and you're really pushing forward on, a center column, that's okay. We're going to have the same thing with UAS. There's a SAE group that's already looking at standards on that. When I look at how NHTSA interacted in those early days, they really mandated a lot of those standards. And they did it based on issues of safety. So we had airbags now because we knew that was an issue. And we had ABS because we knew that people skidded, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's going to be happening. I'm seeing the beginning of it with UAS. But we don't, unlike NHTSA, and they didn't start until like the 70s, starting collecting data on operations and what's happening in the real world. We don't have an accident database for UASs. Once we collect enough of that, there'll be a group like SAE that'll come up with a standard. It'll be something silly like, how high the throttle stick ought to be on the ones that are, in your hands for controllers. But you guys need to think about the other side, the data side. Again, if NHTSA didn't have the data and say we have, 3,000 deaths a year because of, something that airbags would have helped, then they can mandate it. Because you're going to have to go to Congress too, because they're not going to be happy with changing any laws, right? Because it's going to cost somebody money. Is there a thought for collecting the data in a way that we could do human factors accident analyses?
Steve? Wes?
Yeah, could you guys talk about what does exist? Because I know it's not like nobody's thought about this at all. I know it's not there yet, but.
There's also another mic there, too, if you want to take that to your seat.
So it is on. Okay, so it's a really interesting question, and I'm very much a data-driven person as an engineer, so I agree that we should be collecting the data so that we can use it to improve the system later. It's all, perfectly in harmony with our SMS type of approach to things. The challenge we have is that right now for the small UAS in particular, 107 is an operational rule, and the operational rule currently doesn't really require a whole lot of reporting back of details of events. We do have a system in place where you have to report if there's some event that happens, especially pilots see one as they're on an approach somewhere, and you guys have probably seen the long list of daily reports that come out where people are seeing them in flight. But as far as the operators and reporting their actual incidents and things that happen, it's a pretty loose loop right now under 107. So, and that's really, it makes sense because those are inherently meant to be low risk operations. So the challenge we face as an agency is where do we draw the line of the expansion of 107, and as we go to look at operations over people, potentially looking at, beyond line of sight or extended operations, what are the kinds of data that we want to collect, and how do we compel that data to be collected? Because we don't have, the collection systems on board the aircraft like a flight data recorder right now on the smalls. Some of them are doing it on a voluntary basis for their own liability purposes, which is kind of interesting, like the DJI Phantom. I think the newest model, when you log into the system and plug it in to download your flight path, it actually sends all that data back to DJI, and they have your operational data. But they're doing a lot of that just because they want to keep themselves from being liable for somebody's operational stupidity, I guess is the way I would put it. But we should be certainly considering what data we need. And so I know in our discussions early on, gosh, I think it's probably been 2 years ago, we started talking about the kinds of parameters that we would want to collect and things. And it may be on a voluntary basis for the smalls and then a required basis for the large ones. But the story's not done yet. So I think maybe that's something as a good action item out of this. We have the parameters on the aircraft that Aircraft Cert's familiar with. We have flight data recorders. We know what we record. But what's unique about UAS, the operational scenario that they were in, the exact place in the airspace they were in where something might happen. You could have a small UAS reacting to another aircraft that then flies away and is no longer a factor. But the UAS operator flew to miss something else and then hit a building or something like that. There could be, things that we could collect that way. So just something to consider. I like the idea, but right now we don't have a mechanism in place to do that. So
NHTSA doesn't look at the data on the vehicle, although with the V2V now that's going to happen. They require, for fatal accidents, there's a fatal accident reporting system. There's also, if there's injury or damage of so much. So it's police reports. So you can request those. The FAA owns everything from the grass up, as I keep being reminded. So you can request those. As a federal agency, you own the airspace. You can start thinking about all police reports have to go in. You're not going to probably get the insurance reports. You may not get the reports from the individual UAV developers, but you certainly can get the police reports.
I think one challenge to that's going to be figuring out which accidents are caused by human factors issues and which are just bad actions on the pilot. So is it design induced because of the control station or the controller is so poorly designed that it creates the accident? Because a lot of them will get thrown into a database and labeled,
We have that now with manned aircraft.
Exactly.
We're not going to
And I
know
was-
until we collect the data.
Exactly, and I was just about to say that next. We have that now. It gets labeled pilot error. So, we're going to have to really discreetly go through them to try to figure out which ones are really the pilots were led down the wrong path because of the design.
And it's not just accidents. We need how goes it kind of information as well. Because one of the concerns that I have is, you mentioned we're doing this all based on risk analysis and what we think the risk to be, but we don't really have the data to know what it really is. And so we need the data that'll tell us what the real operations are like, not just the bad events. So if we're really going to look at this, you might as well think about how do we get what we need in the larger picture, not just accidents and so on.
Phil?
So one of the speakers on the ATC panel there was raving about how two of his staff members went with some of your human factors staff to Tower, TRACON, and the like, and how much they learned. And it seems to me that we might want to have a resource to make it easy to say at some point during projects, if we're doing cognitive walkthroughs, HITLs, ethnographic studies, who are those people in these organizations that would benefit and buy into what we're going to ultimately put in a report or recommendations by actually being there.
Yeah, where are the resources that they can call on to
And so not waiting until here's what we found to tell them, but rather saying participate. And it could be they're more just observing what we're doing, but in some cases they literally ought to be participating because they may have some questions or something that add a perspective that makes it more valuable to them. And so I think looking for a way to say who are those groups and how do we develop a relationship that allows us to bring some of their people into some of the kind of exercises that we're doing in various projects might be a very valuable way to get more buy-in from some of these groups and find some things we might otherwise miss even.
I'll just add a little bit to that since I was there. One thing that we found is that we're learning, but especially they're learning, what can be fixed right now. For example, the flight plans are filed in lat long, and controllers don't have any idea what these lat longs refer to. And so one of the things that came out of it is when we went to Edwards, they asked NASA, can't you just give it to us in navigational fixes? And they said, well, yeah, sure. So that's a takeaway that we can fix right now that's going to be immense improvement for the controllers knowing where these guys are going and where their lost link points are and a lot of other things. So there were many of those, quick fixes that have nothing to do with the data that we were going there to collect, but we're going to be able to make some good improvements.
Yeah, but one of the issues with solving that problem, the way you're talking about, is that, the legacy systems right now are not all capable. So NASA may be able to send you the nav fixes, but the military isn't necessarily going to be able to put those into the ground control station and ensure that the aircraft is going to be able to follow them, because not all their ground control stations are going to be able to, right? So it's still a systems problem, and not just, we could fix this one. Well, you might fix the NASA aircraft, but you might not fix all the other ones.
Hey, Bill. Sorry, just one quick clarification to what I said earlier. I just wanted to make sure nobody was led astray by what I said a minute ago about the 107 rule reporting requirements. I just wanted to read it real quick so everybody's clear. It says, basically, you must report to the FAA within 10 days of any operation that results in a serious injury, loss of consciousness, or property damage other than to the UAS itself that's more than $500. So we will be getting operational safety data in that context, but not the actual aircraft parameters, where it was, that kind of stuff. So just wanted to clarify. Thanks.
And Wes, while you're still up, well, we heard the ATC stuff and we heard the AVS stuff, and ATC, there's mention of putting in, working with them and having the AMS guidance where we can help them out and put stuff in, and in AVS, similar things, but really in AVS, it still has to be in ACs or the human factors guidance. And so I'm going to ask you about, so I think that I've heard that the appendix that had the human factors stuff in the AC that you're working on might have to be removed because the whole thing's getting big, and it's understandable. And so one of the questions I have is, when we have the human factors guidance, there's all these people making standards, there's standards kind of all over the place, and then, ICAO is working on stuff now. Alan Hobbs at NASA has been doing control station guidance that's, I guess, going to be delivered, and there's papers on this topic, and where is it all going? I mean, in the end, I'm not going to say that none of it matters, but it really should all be leading towards an AC policy, some guidance within AVS, and what do you see as the opportunities for that?
It's a great question. So, yeah, just to explain a little bit more about the evolution of the draft advisory circular, it grew to be, several hundred pages long, and when we sent it up to the proper channels to be reviewed, to be released, it was met with a lot of, well, we don't have time to look at all this. So what we're basically doing is we're going to take the process parts of the AC, which is how to get a type certificate if you're an unmanned aircraft, applicant, you want to come in and go through the TC process. We're going to take that part out and put it into either an order or a shortened AC that kind of explains the 2117B certification process for special class of aircraft. A lot of the appendices that we had in there that were sort of a compliance checklist example and the human factors guidance or some of the ground control station design characteristics, those will be put out into maybe some best practice documents of some type. We're not quite sure what form yet. It may be a separate AC, it may be something else. And Steve Pliszka and I have been talking about that a little bit too, because he had some ideas on, and Michelle Ye, on how to maybe put some of this stuff out as a, we have the human factors job aid, and well, maybe we just add in a chapter on UAS, control station design or something like that. So we're still kind of talking about how that would best come out. I also see a role for, somebody had mentioned SAE, and we have SAE, RTCA, ASTM, we have all these standards bodies. And my hope is that the industry will take charge of some of this on their own and say, hey, they'll look out there across the board and they'll look at maybe some of the less educated players that want to get in and just are trying to make money and sell something quick that don't have a well thought out and well engineered design. If there was a ground station, design standard, for example, for handheld controllers for small UAS that was put out as an industry standard, we wouldn't be in control of it, but we could certainly recognize that as a means of compliance or something through documentation that way too. So there's lots of different ways for the standards to get recognized. There's probably some work that could be done, within, somebody had mentioned, as I said before, the SAE standards that are underway and things like that. So I know the way Peggy puts it is that everybody over 2 feet tall is interested in unmanned aircraft systems, and everybody has ideas about how we should be certifying them. So I'm sure there'll be lots of help from just about anybody you can think of in putting standards on paper. So.
Yeah, and it sounds like that's, so it's uncertain where the home could be for this. And I don't know how important that is in developing the guidance. Sometimes it matters, sometimes it doesn't. But it sounds like it's still a ways off in determining what that could be.
Yeah, I think things right now.
Which is concerning to me, that we've been doing this all these years and we still don't know where's it all going to go.
Yeah, well, so much of the design depends on the intended mission too, and the level of automation, because if you just had one design, you might have somebody that came in and said, well, I don't need all these instruments you've asked for because my aircraft flies a pre-programmed flight path, and all they really care about is a map where it is and a big red button that says stop flying if it starts to go where it's not supposed to. So I understand why the standards haven't really gelled, because the number of uses, number of areas of operation, the types of aircraft, all that. But on the other hand, there's been some really good work that's been done and lessons learned from prior designs and what's gone poorly. As Steve George mentioned, the dual use controls that you can either change something on the aircraft or shut the engine down, and somebody accidentally shut the engine off or put it into beta. There's some obvious ones that we would like to get out there to make sure people are following single function for single control if it makes sense to do that. So, but again, that doesn't always make sense. There are cases where a dual function control can work just fine if it's labeled right and things like that. So, but yeah, so we're kind of letting things evolve, and we have the guidance that's in the draft AC that we're using in the course of our TC programs. We're also using our multi-pilot system usability evaluation, the MIPSU process, and we've called in, pilots to look at a new design and say, is it suitable for use for this type certificate? And we've gotten some great involvement from Buck Joslin and some of our other folks on that. So after we've been through the process a few times, I think some of those standards will start to gel out into a document as well. So.
Well, I got just a quick comment on that is and I've heard this much a lot of times before regarding automation, especially because on some platforms you just push a button and it does this, and on some platforms it's very manual. And we have a lot of that in manned aircraft too right now. But there's this like anything basically, which means it bothers that answer kind of bothers me, because are we going to say nothing because there's too much variability out there, or do we make a zillion categories and say something within each of those categories? How in the world do we expect to write, best practices or whatever when there's that much variability in terms of, we're not saying that any system has to do this or be at this level of automation. I mean, if you allow automation to sort of be everything, then obviously the interfaces and the procedures are very different depending on that. But so that's the one thing that's just confusing to me, is how are we ever going to overcome this? Because at least in manned aircraft today, yes, there's various levels of automation, and there's stuff that there's guidance that addresses these systems, but there's also always a manual control element to it, and there's guidance on that too, on the displays, on the controls and everything. So you have both, and if we're not going to have both, I mean, and it's just everything. I'm struggling in my head with what the form of our guidance would look like, and how do we make sure that we keep working towards something that's going to ultimately be useful, or do we just wait it out? Do you understand sort of the issue that I'm having? I just don't see it happening, and I don't know how to really overcome that problem. Otherwise, we just keep generating real high-level general things that, you know, that's what Access 5 did, and you know, SE 203 kind of did, and, you know, it's of limited value, I think. Any ideas there? No.
So, Bill, just to make you feel a little better, you know, what we've been doing for aircraft that look like about the size and energy and performance of a currently certified manned aircraft, or, you know, so the larger category aircraft, we would be using like our Gamma publications for, and the RTCA publications for, you know, moving map displays, or you know, the parameters that are displayed for attitude and airspeed. So we try to go back to what we know. The only time that really falls away is if they have some new and novel, you know, use for the aircraft, or some new and novel level of automation where those parameters wouldn't be necessary. But that would be evaluated on a case-by-case basis with our human factors and flight test folks and certification engineers. So for the most part, if it looks like an airplane and flies like an airplane in the NAS with the rest of the aircraft, the control station is going to probably look like a typical, you know, control, you know, or cockpit or flight deck. Depending on the mission, there may be additional parameters that are needed that we would identify to help the pilot with that job for situational awareness. I know people don't like that term, but and then for a highly automated aircraft, some of those parameters could disappear because they're not necessary. So the answer does depend, but at least we try to get our applicants to start with guidance that represents what's the current practice. So it's not just all bets are off.
It depends. That's a great human factors answer.
I'm learning, Kathy.
Yeah.
So one of the other issues that I'd certainly like to hear this group have some discussion about, that is part of it's part of the human factors support, if you will. Somebody said earlier, I was talking to Mara about this, we're not starting from a blank slate in most ways. There's a lot of data out there, a lot of lessons to be learned. You've talked about automation a lot, Wes. There's a lot of data that we have, not just in aviation, but in other things as well. I think we need to figure out good ways to apply the lessons learned from manned aircraft, from outside of aviation, in reasonable ways about human performance and human factors and how that gets applied in this context. So that's something that this community needs to really think about how to do. When do things apply and when do they not? When do they limit our thinking on these new concepts and ideas? How do we keep that from limiting it while still maintaining our responsibility to have a safe aviation system? So those are the high-level questions. The specifics are things that we need everybody in this room to be thinking really hard about and start working on, helping us do. Because I think that's part of the kind of support that's needed, right? So I guess one of the things that I would suggest that this activity consider is, how do we make ourselves flexible? Just to give you an example of what I'm talking about here is one of the divisions in flight standards that has responsibility for new technologies, AFS 400. At one point, I remember the manager of that division talking about a number somewhere in the order of half of their work was pop-up. It wasn't something that could have been anticipated. So they couldn't plan for it exactly. What they had to do was make sure that they had resources to address things that came up that they couldn't have planned for. If you think about what aviation is dealing with, the disruptive technologies, as people talk about, those are coming. There's lots of different ones, UAS, just thinking about iPads and how it's affected things in flight operations, all kinds of things. So I think one of the things to keep in mind is we need to plan for flexibility and to have the resources, expertise, whatever, to deal with things that have come up that maybe we didn't realize at this point is going to hit us in 5 or 10 years. I don't know how you do that, but most research plans that I see don't even consider something like that. I think we better.
Well, thank you. Let's get a round of applause for all three of them. Let's do that. Thank you very much.